Hiring technical talent is tough, especially if it's your first time hiring. Today's Build episode is taken from a live coaching session I did with first time founders. And in the session, I share proven best practices for hiring technical talent. While the session is for founders, a lot of the practices I cover are applicable to anyone looking to hire technical talent. And as you watch the episode, you'll learn how to source and vet technical talent, as well as how to negotiate a contract, scope out the work, and much more. So stay tuned. So the topic for today is, the things that you need to know when it comes to hiring as a first-time founder. And also, having said that, there are going to be areas that I'm not going to cover. I'm not going to talk about how to hire your best friend, who may be an engineer or a designer, or how to hire somebody based purely on equity. And the reason I'm not going to talk about those is I don't think they're very good practices. I have hardly seen situations, except for some of the outliers we hear in the media, of them working out. So my goal is to kind of teach you more of the best practices that I know work consistently. I'm also not going to talk about how to manage a remote team. That's a future topic. We might kind of allude to that here. And we've got an expert, Emma, if any of you want to learn from her. And then finally, a number of these strategies are applicable not just to hiring technical talent. They're going to be applicable to hiring marketers, to hiring salespeople, and so on. But the performance metrics, like how you gauge people for those different roles, is going to be different, right? When you hire a salesperson, they are more quota-based. When you hire a marketer, they have a different set of skills. So we're not going to dive into those areas, but instead we're just going to focus purely on technical talent. And I'll give you a survey at the end so that you can decide what topics you want for future sessions. All right, with that, let's dive into the meat of today's session. And the first thing I will say is, no matter what you do, there's always some amount of pre-work, right? So whenever I talk to a first-time founder, they think, oh, well, now that I've got my tech person, I can start building this thing, and everything is going to be awesome. But really, there's quite a lot of pre-work that has to go in. And the two most critical pieces of pre-work that I often see first-time founders failing to do are going out into the market and testing interest with kind of a prospective customer base. And that means not just, doing surveys or doing usability tests on paper prototypes, but it also means having a willingness to pay and getting at a price point. The second is from that, then having some test customers who are ready to use your product, right? Because it doesn't matter if you spend 3 months, 6 months, 5K, 10K building your product. If people aren't ready to start using your app or willing to help you test it, then you're going to be hosed, right? So I always tell people, remember the pre-work that has to go in before you jumpstart into hiring people, because a lot of non-technical folks get so bogged down on, I need to hire that technical person to even get started. And the truth is, there's a lot of work that you can do prior to it. I always like to use the analogy of building a home. No matter how amazing of a contractor you might find, if you are building on a floodplain, then chances are no amazing contractor is going to be able to build you the house that's going to deal with that situation, right? So you've got to do some research before you get started. We're going to talk about some key areas here when it comes to hiring technical talent. And the first area is sourcing this talent. We're going to talk about some online channels as well as some offline channels. And I'm going to present you with the couple online channels that I have done the most research in and have the most experience with. So the first, and actually let's start with offline because that's kind of the easiest to dive into. So when we're talking about offline channels, right, starting with your network is obviously a great place. And, people do this for probably their first 5 to 10 hires. Now, the thing I would caution you when it comes to hiring from your network is making sure people who are referring, whether it's a technical person or whether it's somebody who's like senior or junior, that the referrer has had some experience with this person, and not just like, oh yeah, they seem really great, I had like coffee with them once, right? Did they actually hire them? Did they see the quality of their work? Would they hire them again? Because too often it's easy for people to be like, oh yeah, my buddy, in Portland is great, but if they've never worked together, the chances are there's going to be a lot of dynamics that haven't been ironed out. So make sure that if you are doing referrals from your network, that you're getting folks who have worked for your referrers. And then the second thing is you're very explicit with the people in your network around what you need. I can't tell you the number of times I get emails that say, yeah, it would be great if you could just send over engineers. And I'm like, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Again, likening it to a contractor, there are some contractors who will do condos, some that will do houses, some that will do tiny homes, right? So the more specific you can get in your ask, the more likely people are to respond to your requests and to tell you, oh, yes, I know somebody, or you know what, I don't, but now I know the type of person you're looking for. So get as specific as possible. Be persistent about it, because the first email that you send, people are going to be like, oh, okay, whatever, right? So kind of explain, keep that going. And if you see somebody in their LinkedIn that you think may be amazing, then it's totally okay to say, hey, I saw this specific person, would love an intro. Here's a quick blurb. So do as much of the work of making the intro as you can, rather than like, I just like you to do this introduction, right? These, again, maybe all things that you are already familiar with and are doing, and if so, keep it up. Same thing when it comes to events and trade shows, or if you do any speaking offline, right? Use this as an opportunity to talk about who you're hiring, the type of person that you're looking for, and get, again, as detailed as you can. Are you looking for just remote hires? Are you looking for somebody who can be self-directed? Are you looking for somebody who has experience with on-demand or mobile? Or a web-based product, right? So get as specific as you can. So now let's shift gears to talking about online. And I really love online because I really think you can scale much more than you can offline, right? You can find more people, you can sift through a lot more candidates. And my preferred platform is Upwork. So I'm gonna share my screen with you around Upwork, and I'll explain why I love Upwork. Let's see. Okay, so let me know when you all can see my screen. Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. So this was actually a person, Greg, that I ended up hiring last year for a project. And here's the reason I really enjoy Upwork. And Emma, maybe this is some feedback for you. But the first thing is I get to look at Greg whenever he comes in as a candidate, and I get to see all of his contracts and the length of them. And this is really important because there's a lot of people who will do like 5 hours of work here, 2 hours of work there for a month and just kind of keep doing that. But that doesn't give me a sense of, is this somebody that can stick around for a long time, right? So in looking at Greg's profile here, I can see, oh, he did something for this company, Outvoo, from August to April. That's a good chunk of time. I can even see how much he got paid. So there's a lot of transparency in this system. I can see his reviews as well. And most importantly, I can see the recency of the work. And what I mean by recency is he's been basically working up until April of 2018 on this platform. It's not like he did something 2 years ago or 5 years ago and then never came back, right? So he is very, very active. And the other thing I can see is like he's been doing this for quite a while. There's stuff that goes back to 2015. I think actually it goes back to 2014. So he's been on this platform for about 4 years now. I can also see the quality of the reviews, right? I can see this was my first app. I was looking for a developer who knew what he was doing, would consult with me as I went through the development process, and would treat this project as if it was his own. That's pretty big, right? Even if those words came out of Greg's mouth, that's fine. But having that kind of detail in terms of the review is really critical versus Greg was great. Like, that doesn't tell me anything. So look for some detailed reviews. And then, if possible, look for what they did and didn't do. And sometimes it's hard to gauge just from reading the reviews. You may have to dive into a conversation to get that information, right? So look for those sorts of cues as you are whittling down candidates. Now, in looking at Greg's kind of job success rate, you might be like, ooh, it's 94%. Okay, he's top rated. But here's the thing. Because he has so many reviews, like 36 jobs, it's going to be hard to find 100%. There's always going to be somebody that's like, I wanted a little bit more, right? So 94 is pretty good. The other thing I really like about this is I can see how many hours here on the right Greg is available. So if I need somebody for 30 hours or 40 hours or just for 10 hours, I can see that. I can see where he's located because for me, I really want to hire developers who are in one of the US time zones. And there's another section in here where people have to take tests. And I can't find it immediately, but know that it exists. So if you're concerned about, do they know things like specific frameworks, specific languages, then a lot of people will go through and take these tests on Upwork and it'll score them so that you can start to filter and say, oh, I want somebody that has a 80% or higher score in mobile development or specifically in Android versus iOS, or even within iOS, Swift versus Objective-C. So there's a lot of stuff here that I found super helpful. Now, when I contrast this platform, Upwork, to using other platforms, even like Hired, I found it to be very challenging. When I talked to the folks at Hired, what they told me was, our value prop is, unlike LinkedIn, we will get you a response. And that to me was not good enough because I still needed to know, if you give me a set of leads, are they available in my time frame? What's the quality of the work they've done before? What are the past projects they've done, right? And so I have to kind of suss out all of that information that pretty much Upwork gives me here for free, just in perusing, right? So keep these things in mind as you're evaluating which platforms to go for and how much work you're going to need to put in as you are going through their candidate list. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect system. I've certainly had cases where people have said some rude things on the platform, some people who, not necessarily misrepresented. I think they do a pretty good job of finding the people that represent themselves well, but you do still have to make sure that there is consistency. And that's why I say looking for those reviews, looking for that recency helps you tell versus like someone that's had 3 jobs with all 5-star reviews, right? So you have to use the platform to your own benefit. Now, I know one of the questions, I think Dee brought this up, was how do you get the best candidates, right? So a couple things I will say. The first is, and I know price is always an issue, so we'll talk about that. But the first is, it's really how you craft your job description, right? And so I try to make it as specific as possible. And here's an example of my job description. And you'll see here, I mentioned I'm looking for somebody that's experienced. They're a Ruby on Rails developer. They have created APIs for mobile and for the App Store. And then I go into, a little bit around what we're developing. And then I have this huge list of must-haves. And that's okay, right? Because I do want all of these things. And it's funny, even after I put this list of must-haves, you'll see here I put like not accepting agencies and subcontractors. There inevitably is somebody that will ping me and be like, I'm from this agency, right? So just because you put it out there doesn't mean everybody will listen or read it. But it's good to have this for you as a checklist. I've also found that when you do this, you as the client get taken more seriously by the higher quality people. So that's why I recommend doing this and doing this as kind of your first homework assignment. The other thing that you can do, which I really liked on Upwork, is you can ask them some very pointed questions. So in this case, I was developing an on-demand app. And my first question is, have you developed an on-demand app, right? Because I don't want somebody who hasn't done this before or who is interested in learning how to do it. Like, I don't have the budget or the bandwidth to do that experiment. The other thing I do is I ask them for, examples of work they've done, why they want to work on this, and what their process is. Now, this might seem like a pretty big barrier to getting quality folks, but again, the quality folks are going to take the time to answer these questions. I've even noticed people will quickly go through them, and when they do that, I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to take a phone call with you. If you didn't take the time to answer my questions, I'm certainly not going to get you to the next stage, right? So have your qualification questionnaire. Now, you're probably wondering, what about budget? I actually do recommend that you start off not necessarily on the highest tier, right? So on a platform like Upwork, the highest tier is probably around $200 an hour or $250 an hour. You don't have to necessarily go that high. I would say look for about 20% higher than what you're willing to pay. And I know that might seem like, why would I do that if I can't pay that or if that's not in my budget? Well, here's the funny conversation I had with developers who are higher quality. They're just as concerned about having a high quality client as you are about hiring a high quality person. So they deliberately price themselves just a little bit higher so that they know people who are trying to build an app for $500 or $1,000 or $2,000 in some ridiculous time frame aren't going to approach them, right? They're kind of weeding themselves out. So in Greg's case, I know when we started, I think he was around $80 an hour, and that was a little bit outside of my price range. Once I had gotten him through my hiring funnel and I knew he was my candidate, I actually had the conversation with him and said, look, this is a little out of my price range. Would you be okay with something like $65 an hour or 60 an hour or $65 an hour? And he was totally fine with that because he had seen how serious we were, how professional we were. And I also said, we'll do this for maybe the first couple months. If it's not working out, we can renegotiate it, right? But the reason I didn't lowball is because I didn't want somebody being disgruntled and being like, can't believe I'm doing this thing for $30 an hour. It's so low. And then of course people get demotivated. They're not interested. They take shortcuts. They may lie about their hours. So actually having that medium price point helps you find the right talent. On the flip side, I would not recommend you hire the most expensive person unless you really feel like this is in my price range, this person is awesome, and they fit all of your other criteria. But don't think that just because you're paying at the top of the price range, you're going to get the best quality. Now, the other couple things to keep in mind are people who are just really overeager, like they're zealous about working for you and they're pinging you all the time. And if this becomes an issue, you can contact Upwork. Two other things to think about are how many clients do they take on, right? If this is an individual, think about this yourself. If this is an individual who is managing a project, do you really think that they can do 10 clients in a given time frame? Let's just say a reasonable 40-hour week, unless they're doing an hour of work for every person, even that context switching, the check-ins, the communication, that's a lot, right? So I typically ask this question early on of how many clients do you have currently? You don't have to tell me the hours, but I at least want to know how many you have because I don't want to be one of many. And I'm not saying I need to be the client, but I need to make sure that I have some of your focus, some of your attention. The other thing to suss out is, are they in a period of transition? I get a lot of folks who are like, yeah, I'm so excited about this project. By the way, I can't start for a month, or just wanted to let you know that I'm going to be on a very heavy conference traveling schedule this summer. If they're already telling me this, this is a huge signal to me of, yeah, they're probably going to be late on their work. They may have trouble meeting my deadlines, or if they're doing something like a new pricing model, then they haven't really figured out if this is going to work for me. And it might cause me more pain and chaos than someone who says, this is what I have to offer, take it or leave it. And yes, I'm available, guaranteed for 20 hours a week. right? So the people who are just more upfront about about these things, I found end up being the best partners and lasting the longest. Once you've drafted up the requirements, and I've given you an example of this, and you have your nice to haves versus your must haves, right? And as well as the questions, you can, on Upwork, you can invite people. So Upwork will give you a list of people and you can hit the invite button. Some people will politely decline, some people will be interested, but the phase after this is to set up a phone call. So what I recommend is people should have answered your questionnaire. You should be happy with their answers, and then set up 15, 30 minutes. And in that period of time, introduce the project again. Like, I know you've already done it, but it's just good to make sure that people are on the same page and know what the project is about. A lot of times, you'll put things in there like, this was a mobile project, and then they'll be like, oh, I didn't know if this was Android or iOS, or is there a desire to do Android after you've done iOS first? So this kind of helps you level the field. The next is talk about why you're working on what you're working on and your particular role, right? So if you are the designer, if you're the technical person, if you're the PM, like, give them a sense of how you're going to interact. Again, for these sort of higher quality folks, knowing that is very valuable. And so keeping that in mind, they want to know, why it is that you're interested in this, because that's going to motivate them as well. And then understand their time frame for getting started. So a lot of times people will say, they'll just kind of opportunistically take these calls, but they may be completing work. And that might be another 2 weeks or 4 weeks. So bubble that up and say, like, when do you think you could get started ramping up? And it's okay if it's going to be like a couple of weeks, right? You would rather them have their full focus than trying to shuffle things around. The next thing is they need to give you a process, especially if you're not technical, right? Or if that's not something you want to manage. So if they can't walk you through what their steps are, from taking in requirements to, writing some test cases, doing the development, etc., then chances are they're not as advanced as they would like to be, or they're not going to be a good fit for you. And in having to communicate that, you get a sense of how good they are at communicating. And then once you've done that kind of wrap-up call or that intro call, then you can explain to them whether there are some next steps. I kind of like to keep this open-ended, and if I'm going through a lot of candidates, I might even say, today and the next couple of days or the next week, I'm going through all the candidates. I'll get back to you in a week with whatever the next steps are, right? But give them kind of a clear time frame. It's just good practice. Like, you don't want people to take on other work, and if you give them that, like, hey, we're going to meet in a week, or we're going to talk in a week, or you're going to get an email, then they have their expectations set. From this, if you want them to do some technical work, if you want to gauge their technical skills, this is a good stage where I often will either, because I'm technical, will do the screen, or what I would recommend is have somebody come in and do a little bit of a technical screen. If you don't have a technical advisor, I do have a suggestion for how you can get at that information. So we'll get into that in a little bit. But the second thing that I want you to think about are some of these gotchas. So subcontracting. This is very, very hard to suss out. But most people, you can tell by the way they're answering their questions whether they're subcontracting or not. And what do I mean by subcontracting? So that person that may be charging 100, 150 an hour, or even 50 to 80 an hour, right? And it doesn't always have to be the case. The price point is not the indicator, but I'm just giving you an example. They might say, you know what, I'm going to pose as if I'm the developer on this project or the designer, and then I'm going to subcontract the work out to somebody who's gets paid $15 an hour in name your favorite foreign country, right? So if you don't want subcontracting, if you are concerned about the quality, then you need to be very explicit and even put it into the terms. Sometimes subcontracting makes sense, right? A developer may say, hey, there are pieces of this project that I know in the interest of time I can't get done. Is it okay if I hire additional talent, a designer, front end versus back end, or somebody to help with the deployment, right? But have that conversation early on and have that conversation around who is going to manage that person and have access to their work, right? I've seen too many cases where they, people have said, yeah, I hired this guy or this person, and I didn't even know that they weren't doing any of the work. And then I didn't have access to the code, and I was completely thrown off, right? So talk about subcontracting early on and your comfort level with them doing it. And of course, suss it out based on their answers, because a lot of times people will lie about it, and so you want to get as much information as you can. The other thing is, how are they going to check their work, right? When you're in a team, there are code reviews. There are ways to ensure quality that there aren't when it's just an individual developer, right? So do they have some checks in place? Are they going to do some testing? Are they going to have maybe one of their buddies who's a freelancer look over their code, right? But how are they going to ensure the quality of your code base? And then make sure you also are upfront around work that they feel very comfortable doing and work that they may not feel comfortable. And this might be a little bit of a harder conversation. So if there's some follow-up questions around this, I'm happy to answer them. But an example is, again, coming back to the house, right? If I'm a contractor coming in, I might say, my goal is to hire the best talent, and I'm going to get you somebody who's going to do the paint and the lighting, because I'm not an electrician, and all these other pieces, right? And maybe that's included in my hourly rate, or maybe we need to hire somebody else. But these are the areas that I feel I can certainly do, and these are the areas that I'm not comfortable in, that you would need to hire somebody, or I can help you hire that somebody, right? And it's better to have that, again, upfront, rather than all of us saying, I don't do electrical, or, well, we didn't talk about that, right? And so similarly, in the case of building an app, this could be things like, I don't do design, or I don't know how to launch, or I don't know how to deploy to the Google Play or the App Store, or to Heroku, or whatever the platform is, right? So make sure you have a sense of what are all the pieces of your product that they feel comfortable doing for you outside of just general feature work, and have that conversation early on, because again, it may mean that you need to hire other people, or if they know somebody that, again, still meets your criteria, you can bring them in on a needed basis. Now, we mentioned that oftentimes, if we don't have a technical advisor or somebody that can walk them through a technical screen, what I recommend doing is whittle it down to maybe 2 candidates or 3 candidates that you really like, just in terms of a culture fit, you have a good sort of gut reaction to them, and then give them a really small project. It doesn't have to be huge. You can cap it to like $200, $500, whatever it is that you want, and a set number of hours. It's good if the project is realistic in terms of that time frame. Or if you're like, I just want to see how much they can do in 5 hours, that's cool too, right? But make it clear what the project is, what you expect as a deliverable, and then what the grading criteria is. So if you want somebody to maybe create a static landing page, say, I want to see you design this landing page for me, and here are the things that it needs to have. It needs to have like these 3 sections, and I'm going to grade it based on like how well it loads, how well it looks, maybe some additional functionality like an email capture, right? But be very clear about it. And also, if possible, set them up on a sandbox. You don't want them mucking with like the rest of your code if you have an existing product. And if those are things that you don't know how to do, we can talk about how to do them on GitHub as like a follow-up question. The thing to be careful of here is, what do they deliver? Or the reason you're doing this experiment is to see what do they deliver in that 5 or 10 hour period. How do they communicate? Do they ask questions? Or do they ask for extensions? Do they come up with excuses? Or my classic favorite is, a lot of people don't even do the project. They're like, oh, I'm not going to do it. And it's like, great, then I can move on with you as like not being a candidate, right? The reason I say to pay them a little bit, and maybe you do like 50% or 75% of what their hourly rate is so that they'll take it a little bit more seriously, right? But if they're not even willing to go that far, then they've just weeded themselves out as a candidate. And I've always found that people who go through, do the project, even if they complete about 80% of it, end up being a better hire than of course, people that don't do it or kind of like, this isn't worth my time. All right, so once you get past that project phase, that's when it's important to go back to their references. And I know everybody says like, oh, references always say glowing things. Should I even bother, right? But there are things that you can suss out by talking to some references. And what I ask from people is that they give me references that they've worked with in the last 6 to 12 months. So I don't want somebody that they worked with 5 years ago who was amazing. Maybe that was like a different period in their life, or they might not have had the same technical prowess that they have today. I want somebody that's more recent. 2 years is probably okay, like pushing it, right? But talk about what they specifically did. Like, what was the work that was done? What was the quality of it? Did they do things like, did they go above and beyond, right? And of course, issues are going to come up. Bugs are going to come up. Deadlines are going to get missed, etc. But how did they handle those issues? It's more important to have those conversations and to also talk about areas that they were unfamiliar with. Did they say like, no, I'm not going to do it? Or did they take some time to learn and come up to speed? And how well did they communicate? Did they have regular check-ins? Was there a kind of process? And if there are delays, because delays are natural, right? Why did they come up? How did they get resolved? And what was the final thing, right? So this is a great way to test what somebody actually did versus what maybe they said on Upwork or they said in a conversation, right? So if someone says, oh, I built this app, or I built 3 5-star apps, it's like, sure, I'm sure that they built some piece of it, but did they build the whole thing, right? And some people might, like, I'm not saying they don't exist, but it's a good way for you to suss out and say, oh, you know what, they just like fixed 2 bugs, or they just built the front end, or they just did the design work, or they came in at the very end and helped with launch, right? So that's a good way to get references to give you a little bit more information, because no matter what, they're going to be like, oh yeah, this person was amazing. So get at the deeper issues. And this is the kicker question that you absolutely need to ask if you don't ask anything else. Would you hire them again? And if you would hire them again, why or why not, right? I always get people that if you know when they're on the fence, because they're like, well, I would hire them again if I didn't have anybody else, or if they were like the only developer on the planet, or if I had to do something really, really small, or if it was like a prototype project, right? So there's all these qualifiers, and in those qualifiers, you can get a sense of something didn't go right, so chances are maybe the person isn't good. And you'll know, because I've heard from people that have told me this person was stellar. Please don't poach them. I hope they're available in 3 months when we have a budget, because I want to hire them again, right? That's when you know you've hit gold and like, oh, this person really is great. And I can tell because the reference wants to hire them again and is concerned that I'm going to like steal their amazing developer, right? So anytime you have that conversation, you know you're onto somebody good. So let's talk about firms, because a lot of times people want to hire a firm. And the reason they want to hire a firm is because it's a challenge to hire a developer, a designer, a product manager, or a project manager. And going to a firm, you kind of have all those people, right? Or you might decide I want to add marketing, or I want to add a salesperson later on. And there's a lot of firms that offer a kind of the soup to nuts. So it can be really tempting. I'm not going to say whether going with a firm is a better option versus going with an individual developer or creating an in-house team. That's a personal decision you need to make. I'm going to just share kind of the differences when it comes to vetting a firm, should you choose to go down this path. So the first thing is, do not request a quote, right? As much as firms like to think, oh yeah, we totally like have this thing nailed down and we can tell you that your project is going to be, $25,000 and 250 cents or whatever, like it's not realistic, right? So don't even bother requesting a quote. You do want to know the price range. So you could say, in general, if I wanted to build a on-demand mobile app, Can you give me some examples of price ranges, or maybe even like an hourly rate? Like a lot of people will have an hourly rate for their developers, but they'll still be willing to work on a project basis, right? So you can kind of get at the budget, but don't ask them for a quote. It's going to be inaccurate, and it's going to be a waste of your time and theirs. The thing that you want to do is you actually want to jump into the phone screen, into the call, talk about your project just like you would with an individual developer. And then this is what's important, client size. The reason I say client size is really important is because a lot of these firms will have really big clients. They'll have like Starbucks or Nordstrom. And I'm not poo-pooing on Starbucks or Nordstrom or any big brands, but they have budget to waste to run experiments. Oftentimes, they don't care about the quality of the code. They're running a bunch of prototypes. They have these kind of meaty budgets to try things out. You don't have those kind of things, right? So whenever I see somebody with like big branded logos, I get a red flag because I'm thinking, okay, that's great that they have that client base and it's credible, but that's not who I am, and that's not going to meet my needs, right? So get a sense of what their size is. If they service startup clients, what's the frame, like the size of it? How many? When was the last time they did? And again, how many are they working on concurrently? And are those products currently available in the market today? And what was their contribution to the project? And again, this may be coming back to talking to some references to suss these things out. But too often people will say like, oh yeah, I helped, launch Fitbit. Turns out maybe they did like one piece of it, but they did not build the entire app, and they're taking credit for it, right? So be very, very wary of that. The other thing that they will try to do is they will try to push to redo a project. So if you've already got some stuff that you've built, like let's say you've already built 50% of your iOS app, they might come in and say, oh, you just got to start this from scratch. To be fair, maybe you do because there's a lot of technical debt. Maybe your previous development team didn't do a good job. But what's a better option is for them to say, we know you've built some stuff out. It's going to take a little bit longer if we decide to continue on this. Here are the reasons why, right? And then kind of here's why we would recommend you start a new project. But you don't want them jumping into, nope, got to throw the baby out with bathwater, right? Process, if I've learned anything in the last few years of hiring development shops, is above all else, it's important that you suss out what their process is. So who's going to be in charge? Like who is going to be a point person if there's a project manager? How do they communicate? How do they communicate with their team as well as with you? There's a lot of miscommunication. You tell the project manager something, they go back to their developer, and it's like a game of phone. So keep that in mind. There's also a lot of turnover. So a project manager that may have worked on a project may suddenly get promoted tomorrow, or suddenly have to go on a vacation, right? So make sure that you talk about some of these issues of how they, like who's going to be in charge for how long, how do they handle situations like people needing to take time off, what's the handover going to be like, and if there is, how often does that happen, right? Too often there's a lot of this kind of handing off because people get tired of projects or tired of clients or whatnot. The other is, how are they going to ramp up their staff, right? So if you have a project coming up, how much time are they going to take? How are they going to dive into the project? How are they going to expose gaps? They say this person's a senior developer, but all of a sudden they don't know certain parts of a framework that you're using, right? Better that they push back and give you this information up front rather than just say like, yes, we can do this. Yes, we can do that, right? The last thing you need are people who just say yes to everything. It's really important that you meet with the developers as much as you can to know who's working on your project. Some folks, some firms will be very, very specific and say like, oh, every piece of communication has to go through the project manager. And that's not always a good thing, again, because of that game of phone. So you want to very quickly establish, like, look, if things aren't going well with this project manager, I need to be able to work directly with the developers. Is there an option to do that? Right? So make sure that there's some flexibility, or that you can at least get a new project manager, or that you can give them feedback on how you would like things to be managed. And then walk through the entire process from how are we going to do check-ins? Are we going to do them weekly? Are we going to do them every day? How are we going to plan versus how are we going to execute? Are we going to have demos at the end of every week or at the end of every couple of weeks? Who's going to be responsible for releases and deployments? Because a lot of times this is like a totally separate team. And then all of a sudden they'll be like, oh, yeah, we don't do that here. Or like, we just give you the code and you got to go somewhere else, right? A lot of times people won't help with the launch. Sometimes they will. Now, I know Maria brought up the question of bug fixes. Here's the thing. Bugs are always going to come up. However, if people have a good process, meaning they're doing test-driven development, they are consistently doing code reviews, which they should if they have a sizable team, they are giving you a demo, then yes, bugs are going to come up here and there, but they're going to have accounted for them, not be like, oh, we didn't know we were going to have 10 bugs. It's a surprise to us as well. Like that's just unrealistic, right? Better to say, hey, you know what? We know bugs are going to come up. Our recommendation is every second or third sprint, we take some time to do these bug fixes rather than just like adding more stuff. And in general, we recommend that we take some time to pay down technical debt that we've accrued if there are some tight deadlines, right? What you don't want is for people to say, oh, we charge separately for bug fixes, and then we charge for features, and then we charge for, all these different things, right? You start to go down this path of like, okay, seems like you guys have a lot of nuances to your pricing structure. And then understand their tools. If you're not familiar with the tools, they need to have a period where they ramp you up on them. It's totally unacceptable to be like, oh yes, we're using blah, blah, blah tool. Like, here, go watch this video tutorial, right? Because they may have ways that they're using it. They may have ways in which they're kind of segmenting their information, and you need to have a sense of how everything operates. Now let's talk about contracts, and some of this stuff will also apply to your freelancers. So some firms have a required length, like they'll say, I'm not going to do anything less than 3 months or 2 months. I don't necessarily believe that, and that is negotiable, especially if you're concerned around the quality of what they're doing. The things to keep in mind, though, are, okay, what is their notice for termination? Because sometimes they'll have this clause that says, like, must give 30 days notice. Well, if you're on kind of a 2-month contract or a 3-month contract, it doesn't give you a whole lot of time, right? So understand what their termination process is. And then they may also have a clause in there that says, you have to pay some sort of deposit for the termination. So be very, very wary of that. Be wary of who owns the IP, meaning they still need to transition and give you all of the code. So better for you to have access to that repository. If you know that you're going to transition to an in-house team or you're going to want to bring on your own developers, that needs to be included in the plan. So it shouldn't be a line item where they charge you more for it. That's just, it's not a good practice. And then who is in charge of handling the contract? I've had situations where I spoke to the salesperson and then the person handling the contract all of a sudden was like, yeah, that's not how we do things here. And we're like, oh, so I really wish I had recorded that conversation, right? So be wary of like who's doing sales and who's doing the contract and who's going to be responsible for handling it. And also how the payments are going to be handled. How do you get charged? Is it monthly? Is it bi-monthly? Is there a deposit you need to put down? Are there any surprise payments where they say, oh, this time we went over the required 40 hours and we charge double time, right? So better to just have all these conversations up front. And then if you decide to do the fixed versus the hourly, right, it's okay to do a fixed contract. They may already have a sense of how many hours is in that fixed, it might be something like 30, 40, 60, whatever. So they're already accounting for that. And then there may be an additional hourly charge. My recommendation is it's for you to experiment with whether you want to do the fixed versus the hourly. I like to do kind of a 2-month contract where I can see how long it takes for people to get things done. And then again, to the question that Austin asked, to see, okay, if they're consistently releasing features, et cetera, every 2 or 3 weeks, now I know what the cadence is, right? So I can get a sense of like, okay, they're working 40 hours a week. Their cadence is every 3 weeks. We have like a solid demo that I can take back to customers. And so I have a sense of what the budget's going to be going forward. What you don't want is in the first couple months, they've spent all their time, designing one screen, and then they've broken everything else in your app. And then you're kind of like, I don't know why we're going to do a 3rd month, right? So be prepared for the first couple months. It's going to be a ramp up period. You need to be a little bit comfortable in terms of parting with that money. But if you're not, then you may be better off not going with a firm or doing a small project. But it's really going to be like 3 or 4 months before somebody can, at least in a firm, get to a regular cadence. And there will be, in the tools that you use, there will be ways to gauge how people are finishing tasks. And I'll get into that in a little bit. So before we dive into that, launch plan. Do they actually have one? Is it realistic, right? If you're coming in with an idea and somebody tells you that they can help you launch in 6 months, I'd be really surprised, right? Meaning, I'd be surprised if they can guarantee that they have a sense of it's going to be 6 months. More realistic for them to say, you know what, in the first 3 months, we will have maybe some things ironed out. We recommend you test this on your customers and come back to us. And then chances are, in that first 6 months, you may have a demoable app, but there's still going to be things that we need to iron out, right? So don't let them give you a like firm, yes, it's going to be 3 months and you're going to have this like amazing product. And look for that pushback because there's a lot that has to take place. Let's talk about scope creep and bugs, right? I said this before, no such thing as no bugs. The thing that you care about is, do you have a quality team that is going to invest in fixing those bugs, in trying to mitigate having those kinds of bugs, and they also are doing some technical research, right? So they may say something like, hey, I know you want to use Stripe for payments. We've built 3 apps where we've done Stripe with payments, so we feel comfortable. Versus, oh, we've never done that before, but we're very confident that we could do it in 2 weeks, right? Like everybody is very, very confident because they want you to pay them. So instead be like, okay, if you haven't done it before, then let's talk about how you do the research, what would be involved, and is there kind of a quick and dirty V1 versus the kind of soup to nuts, amazing subscription billing system that I want my app to have, right? So be very careful of having that conversation. The other thing is you want to, as you're talking about the work in these planning meetings, figure out the types of things that need to be built. So again, like a house, you need to have your foundation, then you have kind of your bones, then you have all your aesthetics. Same rules apply to software, right? You're going to have kind of your infrastructure that you're going to be deploying your app into the App Store or the Google Play Store or whatnot. You're going to have things like your design. You're obviously going to have a test framework so that things don't regress, right? But make sure all of these pieces are accounted for in the work that people are doing. Because one feature, like adding a button, is not about adding a button. It's adding a button to maybe an existing code base. It's thinking about how this impacts other pieces, right? And for some of you who are technical, you know what I'm talking about, right? But make sure you suss all of that out. And built in, you have the ability to do some customer testing. And this comes back to kind of my initial point, right? You have customers already lined up, because there is nothing more motivating for a firm or for whomever you're working than to get that immediate feedback. It's also a great way for them to see like you're holding them accountable, right? Like, hey, this login screen isn't working. Like, you can tell me you worked on it, but I have 5 customers telling me they can't enter their email, right? So that's way more powerful, having those kinds of conversations. Overall, I would say start small. It's very tempting to be like, oh, this is such an amazing firm, or this is such an amazing developer. I'm going to have them build 4 apps for me, or maybe 2 apps, or like an app and a landing page. Like, again, have them start with one thing, see if they're successful at it, and then you can always add on, right? Versus you have now committed yourself to like potentially a 10K contract or 5K or whatever is like kind of out of your budget. And start with a single feature. So I know this sounds silly, but I often tell people like, can you just create me a login page, right? And let's talk about how you would create a login page, right? And this kind of goes to your question, Maria, that you brought up of how do I break down features? So, okay, I want to create a login page. That means I need to divide up all the work that goes into that, right? And what are some things that we think of? Well, we think we need to have a username, we need to have a password, right? So the first thing is you need to be able to write stories. And I recommend that you actually do this with them a few times rather than just assume that they're going to do all of that themselves. Because again, project managers or product managers all kind of vary in their level of detail orientedness and how well they communicate with their own team. So I would recommend being a part of this. And then once the process, you feel like, okay, it's up and running, they don't need me to sit through every one of these planning sessions, then you can hand it off to them. But don't just come in and be like, okay, they got it, because then you'll be surprised when they don't, right? So the first thing is to be involved in some of these planning meetings and to think through, what do I want to build? So coming back to this example of building a login page, right? What's the first thing? You might say something like, okay, as a brand new user, I want to set up a username so I can log in, right? And so the exact wording is, who's performing the task, what is the task, and what is the goal? And if you are using whatever tool you like, Trello, Pivotal Tracker, you pick whatever tool you like, it should be that specific so that when you look at it, you can immediately see. Now, the thing that you need to do is you need to break that down even further, right? Because what happens? People have the same username. People may fat finger their email address, right? And then your developer's like, oh, we didn't think of those things, right? Better to have those done and to suss out as many corner cases as you can than for your developer to come back and say, oh, that's going to be like an additional 2 hours, 5 hours, whatever, right? So do the initial case and then break it down even further. There may be additional stories like, as a returning user, I forgot my password or I forgot my login. I want to retrieve it so I can log in, right? These are all examples of scope creep that we often forget or discount, but we've been through some of these and we know these are important things. So the more you can suss out in the beginning before you start building, the better off you will be, even though it might seem like, do we really need to have like all these specific things? Yes, you do, because it's now going to mean how much time does this really take? Now, it can be very complicated how people want to do things. They want to use points. Maybe you've seen the interview I did with Heat and Shaw recently. Like, they want to do points, they want to do hours, minutes, whatever. Here's the thing I would recommend. They can choose whatever system they want. The key thing, though, is there is a system And it is consistent in terms of how you are grading each of these stories. And you are keeping track on a weekly basis, at least, of how many of these things are being accomplished, right? So if at the end of week 1, they only get through 5 points, that's okay. If in week 2, they also only get through 5 points, that's okay, right? Because now you have a sense of, you know what, in general, guys, you're doing 5 points a week. What you don't want is 1 week it's like 5 points, 1 week it's 20 points, 1 week it's 2 points. That's when you know something's not right, right? So what you want is a team that can kind of consistently deliver some set of points, hours, minutes, whatever it is that they want. The other thing is coming up with common language. So in general, what I recommend is you have a backlog, and backlog means all the things that you wish will ever be built. It doesn't mean that they're going to get built today. It doesn't even mean that they're going to get built next week, right? But you have it all there. And then you have a section of what people are currently working on. Now, the people who are, or the engineers and designers who are the best often are only working on 1 or 2 things at a given time. And you need to have that transparency of what it is that they're working on. And this needs to include bugs, this needs to include features, this needs to include infrastructure. And it should only be like a couple of things at any given point in time. And then once they're done, they have kind of a next stage of this is waiting to be tested, or this is tested and it's been deployed, or it's deployed and then it's been released. So you may have like 5 or 6 of these, but you as the owner of this product need to have transparency into what is and isn't done. And the reason is because a lot of times people will say, oh, yeah, it's done. And you're like, great, but it's not in the app. So where was the disconnect? Or, oh, yeah, so-and-so was working on it, but they're not working on it anymore. Well, if they're not working on it anymore, it shouldn't be here. It should be back in the backlog, right? So I know it sounds really anal and OCD, but better to have these conversations and better to have a system behind them than to get confused, especially if this is potentially a remote team or you want to hold them accountable. So use the product to hold them accountable. And again, track their progress on a weekly basis. That's it for this episode of Build. Be sure to share it with your friends, your teammates, and your boss. And subscribe to our YouTube channel to receive the next episode. Ciao for now. Build is brought to you by amazing patrons. Our platinum patrons are Andrea Goulet, CEO and co-founder of Corgi Bites; Charbel Saman, founder of Sprintwell; Dee Gill, founder of Chime On; Jamie Hand; and Lauren Hassan, CEO and founder of Developer, as well as the following patrons. If you'd like to join them and support Build, please visit patreon.com/build. In exchange for your support, you'll receive perks like advanced copies of our books from authors highlighted on the show, special pricing on upcoming Femgineer courses, and more.